looking for escapism, I just want to escape.
Welcome back to my disembodied voice. Now, normally in my videos, I pick a topic and put that psychological disorder or perspective through the prism of how it is portrayed in the movies. But for today's video, we're going to deviate slightly. So, instead of picking characters who actively portray our topic on screen, we're going to pick ones which would fit the criteria of today's topic, which is called latent vulnerability, and look at how it could have been applied to their characters. Now, the protagonists I have chosen did not have any or some of these symptoms, and that's more likely because the films were aimed at children, adapted from books, were pure fantasy, or based on fairy tales. So, to be clear, I'm not saying that these films were better or worse for not including this psychological dynamic of latent vulnerability, more that it would have been a fascinating case study if latent vulnerability was applied to them in their individual movies. And, as ever, I'm not reviewing or telling the writers what they should have done, just shoving some beloved childhood characters through a psychological prism and asking, what if? So our topics, or subjects, for today are Rapunzel from the movie Tangled, and Harry Potter from, well, the Harry Potter films. Right then, let's crack on. As I said, in today's video, we're looking at latent vulnerability, and it's important that we grasp what this is first. So we will look at the term, discuss what it means and does, look at biological and personality factors, all evidence-based of course, before discussing each character in depth. So, as you've already heard me say latent vulnerability several times, just what is latent vulnerability? Well, the National Institute of Health define latent vulnerability as the following. Latent vulnerability refers to the way in which neurocognitive and biological systems adapt to early adverse environments in ways that may confer short-term functional advantages but increase future risk of poor psychiatric outcomes. Basically, and in layman's terms, it details how a child who grows up as a victim of maltreatment and abuse may struggle as they grow up with things like social cues, making friends, meeting developmental milestones, which are things most children can do by a certain age, having confidence, managing anxiety, and generally being hyper-aware to the threats which they perceive exist in their minds, but don't really pose a threat in the real world. And it's important that when we come to look at people in later life who are victims of things like domestic violence, who are often prone to re-victimization, latent vulnerability plays a part in that because people fail to see danger, and then this leaves them open to being re-victimized in further abuse. Okay, as that's the definition, let's start off with the biological facets of latent vulnerability. Cortisol-mediated dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter and a hormone involved in emotion, is elevated in adults who have been mistreated as children. This occurs because negative environmental stimuli, such as neglect, can lead to hyperactivity in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which also reduces hippocampal volume on a permanent basis. This is quite literally brain changing. An increased dopamine and permanent hippocampal impairment is evidence-based in mental illness. Also, stress impairs the ability of the brain's parasympathetic nervous system to lower the stress response, which leads to an enduring heightened response to normal stressors. Basically, memory shrinks, the ability to calm and relax disappears, the whole ability to change, switch off, appreciate, remember, see, go through emotions and realize what's happening changes, inverts, and causes people to be left in vulnerable situations. So, staying with the nervous system, let's look at the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Your sympathetic nervous system responds to dangerous or stressful situations by activating an increase in heart rate, which then delivers more blood to areas of your body that need more oxygen, and also lowers your immune system and inhibits insulin, so your body has more energy from glycogen reserves. Now, the parasympathetic nervous system, so called because it's a parachute which slows everything down, increases insulin, lowers heart rate, slows breathing, and generally brings us back from flight or fight to rest and digest, that's what's needed when we are calming from danger. However, as the parasympathetic is triggered when we feel safe, for children with latent vulnerability, they have no quick off switch, live in constant peril, and cannot differentiate between safety and danger, as they always feel in danger, so their responses aren't natural, congruent, and can cause them to come across as odd or weird, whilst their emotions fire for longer and cause more hormonal imbalances. Basically, the young child's brain starts off life as smooth and looks nothing like the wrinkly ones you see in autopsies or movies when they're being dissected. That's because brains change shape as you grow and form language and relationships. Between 2 to 5 years, as language grows and interests form, the brain does something called synaptic pruning, which means the child's brain starts to cut down the neural connections it doesn't need. See how this picture of the brain forms and coils up as it learns, forms new knowledge, and develops into an adult brain. And you can see from this scan how the traumatized child's brain has damages to the frontal lobes, which causes problems in emotional regulation. And that means, because of trauma, stymied development, or growing up in adverse environments, the child lives in near constant fear and anxiety, always on the verge of fight, flight, fawn, or freeze, and the result can be a constant release of stress hormones in the body, harmful enough to alter architecture in the child's developing brain. So when they come into later life and they go to things like secondary school or where there's areas of crowds, there is no parasympathetic nervous system to slow down and no recognition of safe emotional cues. So that's our biology. So let's look at the social aspects of child maltreatment. Child maltreatment is often thought in terms of violence towards a child, whether that be sexual or physical, but maltreatment goes beyond violence in the literal sense. It can be emotionally via verbal insults, threats, serial yelling, or the withholding of love and attention, or even the neglectful provision of basic needs such as food, clothing, bathing, or schooling. Maltreatment can be considered exploitation or harm committed due to ignorance, turning a blind eye, or actively facilitating abuse. Childhood maltreatment is complex and insidious, and it also has no demographic or socio-economic boundaries, so there is no specific look to individuals who perpetuate or have suffered lengthy abuse. So let's recap. Maltreatment is not limited to violence. It can involve neglect of love, provisions, and protection. There are no absolutes. Not all mistreated children suffer from mental illness as adults. However, childhood maltreatment affects biological, neurological, social, and personality development, and when a child isn't familiar with social cues, they are left vulnerable to danger. Now, in the past, I've spoken about personality being the immune system of the mind. Basically, the stronger the personality, the more resistant to stress and confident the person is. But when the personality is disordered, then the more the behaviour warps and the more susceptible they are to infectious social stressors. Now, the personality, or the pattern of characteristics across the whole matrix of the persona, is all about functioning, surviving, and enhancing the experience of the organism. That's you and me, basically. And when we get disordered personality, then our mood tolerance, social behaviour, coping skills, ability to love, and resistance to things like self-harm and addiction are strengthened or weakened depending upon experience. So, a child with latent vulnerability might go to school and be asked into a group to do some work, but rather than seeing this as colloquial, something to bond into, and a method of interaction, they see it as overwhelming, scary, and a threat which needs a threat response, the sympathetic nervous system of fight or flight, and they might lash out, withdraw, or, in layman terms, attack is the best form of defence, or just withdraw completely for their own protection because they have misread the signs of benign social cues. So let's come to Potter and Rapunzel and put them through our prism. Firstly, how and why would they have latent vulnerability? For Harry Potter, his parents died when he was a baby, so he missed out on the nurturing mother and father bond which would have helped his brain form via love, language, and social acceptance. Now, had Harry been sent out to a loving family, he would have still gained those facets, but he ends up in a place much worse than that, as Harry is sent to live with the Dursleys, who lock him in a cupboard, deprive him of food, beat him, and generally make his life a misery. He doesn't have friends, lives in an environment where he is constantly in fear, and his basic human rights are either denied or constantly vacillating between scared and shared. So, Harry would more than likely develop emotionally unstable personality disorder based upon the unstable attachment, perilous environment, and constant fear of being punished. His frontal lobe would have no method of calming an overworked and overstimulated limbic system, and constant cortisol would mean he would be in a state where he was either living in fight, flight, fawn, or freeze, and would leave him with a personality built on quicksand. Basically, no foundations and a complete wreck. Being emotionally unstable means Harry would be desperate to bond with people, but due to having impaired brain chemistry and poorly formed synapses, his brain wouldn't be able to remain in a constant and set emotional state for very long, so he would vacillate between frantic attempts for acceptance and then pushing those people away he was trying to bond with, because they would then have to prove their love for him because he wouldn't understand the basic social and emotional cues of what love and belonging mean. Harry would also find large groups nerve-wracking and, more than likely, be forced to make imaginary friends and play by himself, as he wouldn't have the social, emotional, or psychological skills to fit in with people. Added to that, Harry's a wizard, and it's no wonder really he doesn't go on a wand-based Hogwarts school massacre due to his formative years, which happened between 0 and 8 years old, being stunted, locked away, abused, and treated like a dog by the hateful Dursleys. Rapunzel also has a similar fate to Harry, as she's kept in a tower and isn't allowed to mix with anyone, so she would be socially naive, unable to recognise social or sexual cues, and her perception of the world would be based purely around what she has seen from the window in her tower. She would be awkward, angry, stunted in language, closed to approaches from sexual partners, and her world would be purely based upon the evil stepmother who kept her there. Basically, her frame of reference would be adopted from someone else, so rather than experience the world, live through it herself and form her own opinions, she adopts the ideology of someone who controls her. It's a bit like a cult. You don't have your own opinion, you follow exactly what someone says and spout their ideology, even if you don't quite understand or believe it. Dependent on her disposition, she would either be an introvert who didn't know how to bond and was so fairly mute, or an extrovert who would then bully, attack, or would just be hostile to everyone. Such was her threat response and distorted brain development. And both Harry and Rapunzel would also have all of these psychological problems. An inflated stress response. Evolutionary survival is predicated on the ability to detect danger and mitigate threat, but chronic heightened vigilance and repeated activation of threat predisposes maltreated children to earlier onset mental illness with more intractable symptoms and poorer treatment outcomes. Classic fear conditioning. Fear conditioning is when neutral stimuli such as sight, smells, or sound are associated with threatening stimuli such as violence. These abnormal associations are learnt and remembered where risk is prioritised for processing in the brain and would result in the subject acting out. Dysfunctional strategies, dysfunctional ties. Dysfunctional internalisation, externalisation strategies are common in maltreated children. Compromised social functioning can reduce the social ties that would otherwise be a key protective factor against stress, rendering children more prone to psychological vulnerability. All in all, Developmental traumatology investigations have found that maltreatment disrupts the cognitive, neural, endocrinal, and immune development of children. And in these circumstances, the child is inadequately optimized to negotiate normal situations and everyday demands. That is basically, they can't cope. And then this continues on throughout their adulthood. Now, latent vulnerability does not mean that a future psychiatric disorder is inevitable. Rather, interaction with other risk and protective factors, as well as future stressor exposure, is thought to determine an outcome. Basically, to protect themselves from signs and sounds and situations which trigger the fear response, such as Malfoy threatening Harry or the prince making a sexual pass at Rapunzel, would trigger Harry's and Rapunzel's maladaptive coping mechanisms, and their latent vulnerability would mean that they would either become introverted or extroverted in an extremely unbalanced and incongruent response. Therefore, Harry Potter would either retreat and could begin engaging in acts such as self-harm, addiction, or dropping out of Hogwarts, or, if he were extroverted, displaying antisocial traits such as acting out via conduct disorder, beating the crap out of Malfoy, or damaging school property as a form of expression. Or, if he was a rebellious wizard, he could go home with his wand and completely screw up the Dursleys to the point where he could torture them to death. Rapunzel, on the other hand, upon meeting the prince, could become promiscuous, extroverted, and start experimenting sexually with the man in her tower, or she may become angry and just stab him out of all the emotional propaganda she has imbued from the evil person who's imprisoned her. Or she could become introverted, coil up in the corner, and be prone to being attacked or miss out on a really healthy relationship. Either way, both of these characters are going to have challenging reactions to situations when they either meet new people or have to go and study at boarding school. It's also a good job Hagrid's such a decent fella, as with Harry clearly something of an introvert, his latent vulnerability would make him very vulnerable to a strange man who was kind and offering promises of wonder following his years of systematic abuse by the Dursleys, which, considering it consisted of being beaten and starved, would have needed a child protection plan under social services. Like I said, these are movies and books, and we're not taking them literally, but the aim of this is to show you how the brain adapts, mismatches to safe environments, finds stress and risk factors escalating, and the risk outcomes keep increasing. And joking aside, Hagrid's a good example of a risk factor increasing as, unable to see that going off with a stranger would be bad, Harry would be open to all sorts of exploitation. Also, going to boarding school is tough on even sound-minded children, so unable to adapt and seeing normal interactions as threatening, Harry would more likely be odd, eccentric, weird, stunted in his sociability, and prone to being the butt of all the Slytherin bullies' jokes. That would also increase his risk of either suicide or, like I said, massacring Hogwarts in a wand-based slaughter. Latent vulnerability is something that plays out over a child's life in everyday situations at home and at school. In other words, it's a dynamic process. As adults, we have a key role to play in enhancing the protective factors around a child. This includes supporting their social competencies, their relationships with peers and adults, and their access to new opportunities to grow and develop. Both Harry and Rapunzel have had these denied, and they would struggle to function in their respective worlds. And their emotional dysregulation would give rise to threat processing. Survival is dependent on the ability to detect and respond to dangerous and aversive stimuli in the environment. The child can fail to see safe social cues and dangerous cues, and their behaviours make them vulnerable to exploitation. Like I said, thank God Hagrid was such a decent fella and the prince's intentions were good. And also, reward processing. Learning which stimuli and actions are associated with attaining rewarding objects, experiences, or events is essential to motivate and guide adaptive decision making. Neural alterations in the reward system have been associated with suboptimal decision making and psychological distress, such as the emergence and maintenance of anxiety, mood, conduct, and substance abuse disorders. As I stated before, with Harry and Rapunzel having poor emotional regulation, this means that they would process threats at times of safety and safety in times of threats. Their internal risk assessments in the prefrontal cortex and also orbifrontal cortex, which are to do with executive control and learning, wouldn't have the experience to cope with such massive environmental changes, and thus, upon becoming overwhelmed with things or bullied due to their genuine misunderstanding of social cues, would leave them with increased distress and susceptibility to things such as self-harm, substance misuse, and so forth. Harry's potential for self-destructive behaviours or even accidental harm is greater with him being a wizard, as, although he would have massive deficits in social skills and social processing, toxic emotions such as envy, hate, resentment, and false idealisation means, if he were inclined, he could easily turn his magic onto the Dursleys and cause severe physical and mental harm. However, as I stated at the start of this video, both Harry Potter and Tangled are aimed at kids, and that means we are in very different territory compared to a horror film like the James Gunn produced Brightburn, which dealt with a child, a young Superman if you will, who turned out evil based upon both genetic calling and some poor treatment at school. When it comes to development, latent vulnerability in terms of emotion regulation in maltreated youth suggests that boys and girls might be characterized by distinct profiles of emotion recognition and learning following maltreatment or extreme periods of social isolation and poor attachments. And Freud argued that children, young children, go through 5 stages of psychosexual development during their formative years, and these are the oral stage, age range birth to 1 year, erogenous zone, the mouth. During the oral stage, the infant's primary source of interaction occurs through the mouth, so the rooting of sucking reflex is especially important. The infant derives pleasure from oral stimulation through gratifying activities such as tasting and sucking. The anal stage, age range 1 to 3 years, erogenous zone, bowel and bladder control. During the anal stage, Freud believed that the primary focus of the libido was on controlling the bladder and bowel movements. The major conflict at this stage is toilet training. The child has to learn to control their bodily needs, and developing this control leads to a sense of accomplishment and independence. The phallic stage, age range 3 to 6 years, erogenous zone, genitals. During the phallic stage, the primary focus of the libido is on the genitals. At this stage, children also begin to discover the differences between males and females. The latent period, age range 6 to puberty. During this stage, the superego continues to develop while the id's energies are suppressed. Children develop social skills, values, and relationships with peers and adults outside the family. Erogenous zones become inactive. Basically, the moral constraints of the world and the parents suppress that wild desire to cause havoc and explore, and a personality begins to form. The genital stage, age range, puberty to death. The onset of puberty causes the libido to become inactive once again. During the final stage of psychosexual development, the individual develops a strong sexual interest in the opposite sex. I said at the beginning of this video the formative years are between 0 and 8, and that really covers the oral, anal, phallic and latent period. And it's there that the brain really forms, and it's important we do neuroscience here because neurodevelopment is so important when you're young. Now, Freudian psychology is still respected, but not necessarily with the reverence it perhaps once was, but in terms of attachment, that's something which is very topical in developmental psychology. And that's because attachment provides the infant's first coping system. It sets up a mental representation of the caregiver in an infant's mind, which can be summoned as a comforting mental presence in difficult moments. Attachment allows an infant to separate from the caregiver without distress and explore the world around them. And neuroscientists believe that attachment is such a primal need that there are networks of neurons in the brain dedicated to setting it in motion in the first place, and the hormone oxytocin, which is the love hormone you get when you hug or you kiss or you bond with someone, is important in fostering that process. So for Harry and Rapunzel, being deprived of parents, familiar faces and bonding time, and then being isolated and abused leaves them vulnerable to going out into the real world as social cues, interpersonal relationships and self-expression are all compromised because their neurological development has been severely interrupted. Many abused children are discovered to be being abused by behaviour from their presentation in school, which is often odd, incongruent, or plain outlandish and reckless. Their behaviour can also be extremely withdrawn, as I talked about before, introvert and extrovert. However, latent vulnerability doesn't mean a child will be any of these things, as self-esteem and personality expand and contract, and we have extroversion and introversion, and all these things play dynamics in the world and how we form into who we are. And sometimes, when in a crowd or under pressure or trying to make friends, latent vulnerability means that kids just can't cope with situations which are terrifying to them but normal to others, and because their behaviour doesn't ingratiate them into groups, they end up being even more excluded, and their beliefs that they aren't good enough can be reinforced. However, latent vulnerability isn't all bad. Sometimes a child might withdraw from a group because they don't recognise the social cues, but in that time alone they discover things they enjoy doing, like art or gaming, and can actually form a crucial part of their development. Luckily, both Harry and Rapunzel are pretty darn decent people, and so, in the end, all is well that ends well, and so should it be. In the real world, though, be kind and appreciative to those who seem to be struggling to fit in. It's not that they're weird, it's just that they see the world through different eyes and misinterpret both threats and genuine approaches for intimacy. Anyway, that's it for this week's video, so remember that psychology is cool. It would mean a lot to me if you could hit that subscribe button, as without you guys watching, I can't keep making these videos, and a like and share is always appreciated, or even a comment, as healthy debate on here is always fun. And, as ever, until next time, I'll catch you later.
You're a finished, Harry.